My mother wants me to give her my salary, and she'll give me half if I am a good son. But my counteroffer is so good that now she has to find a job and a place to live. A few days ago, I had a rather uncomfortable conversation with my mother, and I still can't get everything she said out of my head. The thing is, she asked me to deposit my entire salary so she could manage it for me and give me half if I was a good son. Yes, you read that right. She wanted complete control over my money. And honestly, I'm not sure how we got to this point. But I guess I should start at the beginning. I was born and raised in a small town somewhere in the Midwest of the United States. I don't want to say the exact name of the place because I know some of my coworkers are also on Reddit, and that would be too much of a coincidence. It's not that I'm ashamed of where I come from, but I don't like people knowing too much about my personal life, especially on a place like Reddit. What I can say is that I didn't have an easy childhood, though I don't complain too much because I managed to survive. My mother and father divorced when I was quite young. To be honest, I don't remember much of the time we all lived together, but the little I do remember wasn't good. My father was never a great influence in my life, nor did he try very hard. He was a man who drank a lot and worked long hours, but he didn't even work in something that could interest me. I think he just used work as an excuse not to be home, and when he was, he made no effort to spend time with me. The few memories I have of my father are of moments when he was too tired or drunk to even pay attention to me. After the divorce, my mother and I moved to a small house. It wasn't much, but at least I had a roof over my head, and I didn't have to deal with my father's presence. Living with my mother was better than being with him, but it wasn't a perfect relationship either. She was never the most present or affectionate mother. I guess she always did what she could, but she was never like the mothers you see in movies or like the mothers of my friends, who were always there to help with homework, attend games, or just hang out. My mother was more the type who was always busy with something, or just emotionally absent. Sometimes, when I read stories on Reddit about the relationships between other users and their mothers, I wondered if my experience was normal or if I just didn't get one of the good ones. Sure, in the stories where mothers are mothers, and not completely crazy. Despite everything, I managed to survive school. I was never very good at studies, and honestly, the idea of going to college was never on my list of priorities. I was more attracted to the idea of working, especially at something that would allow me to be outdoors. I think I was always more of that type, the kind who preferred to be moving, using my hands, rather than sitting behind a desk or in a classroom. While I was in high school, I worked various part-time jobs, saving what I could with the idea of one day leaving that place. And that's exactly what I did as soon as I graduated. I saved enough to buy a ticket to Alaska and never looked back. Why Alaska? Well, Alaska has something special. There are jobs that not many people want to do, either because they are extremely hard or dangerous, but they pay well. And the best part for me is that many of those jobs let you be outdoors. I'm not going to go into details about what job exactly, because as I mentioned before, some of my coworkers are also on Reddit, and I prefer to remain anonymous. What I can say is that it's hard work, and it's not for everyone, but I enjoy it. I've never been afraid to get my hands dirty or to face tough conditions. In fact, I'd say I thrive in those environments. After moving to Alaska, I stayed in touch with my mother. We didn't have the best relationship, but I tried to call her every now and then to see how she was doing. She did the same, though most of the time it seemed like she only called when she needed something. At first, things were fine. She called to catch up, tell me what was happening in town, how our friends were, that kind of stuff. But then the requests for money started coming. At first, they were small amounts, like $100 or $200, to cover rent or because she ran out of food before her paycheck arrived. I didn't mind helping her. After all, she was my mother, and even though she wasn't the perfect mother, she raised me. So I felt the least I could do was help her out from time to time. However, everything changed a few months ago. My mother met a man, and in no time, he moved in with her. At first, she told me it was a good deal because they would share expenses, and that would help her cover the rent more easily. I didn't know this man, but I trusted that my mother knew what she was doing. I thought if she was willing to let him move into her house, then he must be a good person. But it seems I was wrong, and so was she. After this man moved in, my mother started acting strangely. At first, she stopped asking me for money because, in theory, he was helping her with the expenses, but it didn't take long before she started asking me for money again, and this time the amounts were much larger. She was asking for $800 or $900, and there was always an excuse. Either the water heater broke, something in the house needed urgent repairs, or they couldn't wait until her next paycheck. At first, I believed her, but as the requests for money became more frequent, I began to suspect something wasn't right. I told her no, not because I couldn't afford it, but because I didn't feel comfortable giving her that much money without a clear explanation. Plus, what happened to her new boyfriend? He was supposed to be helping with the expenses, right? If that was the case, why did she need more money than ever? Every time I asked, she gave me a different excuse, but it never made sense. As expected, after saying no several times, the calls started to dwindle. And when I called her, she was distant and cold, as if she was upset with me. In the end, I stopped calling too, because she didn't seem to want to talk to me. Everything came to a head last week. I received a call from my mother, and I thought that maybe, after so long without talking, she finally wanted to reconcile or at least have a normal conversation. But no, what she proposed to me was something I never imagined she would say. She asked me to deposit my entire salary into her bank account, and she would give me half, but only if I was a good son. At first, I thought she was joking, but no, she was completely serious. She said it was my duty as a son because she had raised me and, besides, she was a better money manager than I was. That she knew how to handle finances better and that this way, she could ensure that my money was used responsibly. I had never heard anything so absurd in my life. I told her no, obviously. There was no way I would deposit my salary into her account, much less give her half of my money just because she said so. I even offered her a compromise. I could give her some money every month, maybe $300, but I wasn't going to let her control my salary. Plus, living in Alaska isn't exactly cheap. Between the cost of living, supplies, and the occasional trip to the city, I have my own expenses to cover. But no, that wasn't enough for her. She insisted that it was my responsibility as her son to give her half of my salary, and that she knew how to manage it better than I did. I don't understand why she thinks I'm incapable of managing my own money. If I've managed to survive in Alaska, one of the most expensive and toughest places to live, I don't think I'm that bad at financial management. I don't spend my money on parties or unnecessary things. All I do is work and save what I can. And now that I think about it, how can she say she's a better money manager when she's always asking me for help to pay her bills? It doesn't make sense. I think my mother has lost her mind. And believe me, I know what madness is, because being alone for several days or weeks, with only Moose around, makes you lose a bit of your sanity, but my mother's situation is even worse. I understand that she raised me, but asking me to deposit my money is absurd. So here I am, wondering if I'm the bad guy. But I don't mean refusing to deposit my salary into her account. That's out of the question. But whether I should help her with something else. I understand that she raised me and all that, but do I really owe her anything beyond what I've already given? Am I being a bad son for saying no? Honestly, I feel weird. On the one hand, she's my mother, and I think as her son, I have some obligation to help her, especially if she truly needs the money. But on the other hand, what she's asking for isn't reasonable. I feel like she's trying to take advantage of me, and I don't want to give in to her demands just because she says so. I don't know what to think. What would you do in my place? Update 1. First of all, I want to thank everyone who commented on my previous post. I read all the responses and truly appreciate the time you took to offer your opinions and advice. I know I couldn't reply to every comment, but I really value what you said. Some comments helped me see things more clearly, and they reinforced what I already felt deep down, that I wasn't being selfish or a bad son for refusing to meet my mother's demands. I want to clarify something that didn't seem to come across clearly last time. I wasn't considering, not even for a second, the idea of depositing my salary into my mother's account. It's completely absurd, and I was surprised that some people thought I might be thinking of doing something like that. The reason I posted was to find out if I was wrong for not wanting to give her more money than I had already offered. Because, of course, she is my mother, and although we don't have the best relationship, I do feel a certain obligation to help her where I can. But even that has a limit, and it's not fair that she tries to take advantage of me, especially when she asks for irrational things. In fact, many of the comments made me realize something I honestly needed to hear. I have no obligation to give my mother half of my salary, much less to deposit it into her account for her to manage. Yes, as a son, if I'm in a position to help my parents, I can do so, but it's not an obligation. Furthermore, helping someone shouldn't be under unreasonable conditions or emotional manipulation like what I've been experiencing with her. Now, putting aside the responses and advice I received, some things have happened in the past few days. Specifically, I've had contact with my mother again, but things haven't improved, to be honest. As I mentioned before, she had been angry with me for not agreeing to her requests, and we hadn't spoken much since I told her I wouldn't deposit my salary into her account. However, a couple of days ago, I returned to the city after spending some time in a remote area, which had kept me away from civilization, and from there, I was able to contact her. The call wasn't what I expected. I don't know what I expected from that call, but certainly not what happened. As soon as we started talking, She told me her boyfriend had left her, and according to her, it was my fault. She explained that he expected that, with my financial help, she could stop working and stay home because, according to him, she was no longer young enough to be working all day. That statement left me perplexed. The first thing I thought was, why would someone who needs half of my salary to survive want to quit their job? I told my mother that, and as expected, it didn't go over well. I mentioned that if she really needed that much money, it didn't make sense for her boyfriend to want her to stop working, and that maybe this man wasn't the best person for her. Well, that was the spark that ignited everything. My mother became furious and accused me of criticizing her boyfriend without knowing him. She went on to say that she was just trying to do the best for him and for herself, that if I helped her more, she could have a more comfortable life after having worked so hard to give me a good life. For context, my mother is 48 years old. She's not an elderly woman who can't take care of herself, and what she was asking for simply didn't make sense. Plus, using the excuse that she had given me a good life to justify why I should sacrifice financially was pure and blatant emotional manipulation. I can't deny that it affected me, but at the same time, I realized that this situation wasn't healthy, and as much as it hurt, I couldn't give in to her demands. Despite everything, I tried to reason with her. I told her that this man was manipulating her, that she shouldn't quit her job because she would lose her independence. But everything I said only made her angrier. She was completely determined to defend him, no matter what I said. Eventually, she accused me of being the one to blame for everything. She told me her boyfriend had left her because of me, because I refused to help her financially the way she wanted. And she didn't stop there. She said that if I had been a good son, she would never have had to deal with these difficulties. She made it clear that all I needed to do was deposit my salary into her account, and everything would be fine. The worst part is that I'm not even sure if she meant her account or her boyfriend's. I tried explaining again that I couldn't do that I needed the money for myself, for my own expenses, and to live. But by then, she didn't want to listen to me. I think what came next was what affected me the most. My mother, perhaps out of anger, told me she regretted raising me. That after everything she had done for me, I wasn't fulfilling my duty as a son, and now I was leaving her alone in her time of greatest need. But before I could respond, she simply hung up the phone. Despite everything, there's a small part of me that sees something positive in this whole situation. At least, according to what she said, that guy has left her. That, at least, is something good, though I'm worried about what might happen now that she's alone. Update 2. It's been 2 months since I last wrote, and I have some important updates about what's been happening. I've thought a lot about what happened and the advice I received from you all. In the end, I decided it was time to confront some unresolved issues, particularly with my mother. So I took a few days off and returned to my old town, partly to visit some friends and partly to see how my mother was doing. I hadn't heard much from her since our last interaction, and while we had spoken a couple of times, she hadn't asked for money again. That gave me some hope, so I decided it was time to make the trip. The first thing I did was book a hotel because I wasn't sure what things would be like at my mother's house, especially after everything that had happened between us. And although I didn't know it at the time, that was one of the best decisions I could have made. As I mentioned, I wanted to see some friends too, so I planned a few meetups with them during my stay. Everything was pretty well organized, or so I thought. I arrived on a Friday afternoon, and after settling into the hotel, I decided that the first thing to do was visit my mother. She didn't know I was coming, so I thought it would be a surprise. I didn't expect a grand welcome, considering how things were, but I at least hoped it would be a pleasant surprise. Anyway, I decided to stop by her house, wait for her to come home from work, and say hello. When I got to the door and rang the bell, it wasn't my mother who answered. It was her boyfriend, whom I hadn't had the chance to meet in person until that moment. Honestly, it wasn't the best first impression I could have imagined. Instead of a greeting or a welcome, the first thing out of his mouth was a cold and direct, "Who are you, and what do you want?" He just looked at me as if I were an intruder. I explained that I was my mother's son, that I was visiting, and I saw his expression barely change. He didn't seem very excited to meet me. He yelled my mother's name, and when she appeared, it wasn't any better. Her expression wasn't one of pleasant surprise, but rather of concern. She looked at me as if she didn't know how to react, and the first thing she asked was, "What are you doing here?" She didn't say it in a friendly way, or like someone happy to see her son after so long. It was more like she was annoyed because I hadn't told her in advance. I explained that I had decided to take a trip to visit her and see some friends, but I noticed that she wasn't excited to see me. Instead of being happy, she seemed uncomfortable. The weirdest part was that they didn't even invite me inside. The entire interaction took place at the door, and her boyfriend kept staring at me with a hostile attitude. Then, he decided to jump in and say, "If you have money to travel here, you should have money to make sure your poor mother doesn't have to work anymore." It was my first vacation since I started working in Alaska, and they were making me feel guilty for spending my own money on a trip to visit my mother. I couldn't believe it. The worst part came when my mother said that maybe I had made the trip to give her money. At that moment, her boyfriend's eyes seemed to light up, as if he was waiting for me to confirm that idea. I stayed quiet for a few seconds, processing everything that was happening, and finally responded that no, I was only there for a visit. I also made it clear once again that I wasn't going to give her my salary, not now and not ever. But my mother wouldn't drop the subject. She insisted that if I hadn't come to give her money, then she didn't see the point of me being there. That was the last straw for me. I told her that I hadn't seen her in person for years and that all I was receiving from her was rejection, simply because I wasn't willing to give her the money she demanded. But her boyfriend wouldn't stop. He said that if I had been a good son to my mother, she would have invited me inside without hesitation. At that moment, my mother started with the same old speech, that if I were a good son, everything would be different. I told her that if I wasn't welcome in her house, then I would leave. After all, I still had friends in the city who would be happy to see me and would probably invite me to hang out without making me feel guilty for anything. So, I left. But before I left, my mother ran after me. She told me that I still had time to do something nice for her and that if I didn't want to deposit my salary into her account, I could at least transfer half of my money to her once a month. I told her, very clearly, that I wasn't going to do that. I don't know if it was the frustration or emotional exhaustion, but after saying that, I left without saying anything else. After that, I decided I wasn't going to let that encounter ruin my trip. I spent a few days in the city, visiting some friends and catching up with them. It was great to see them again, and although I couldn't see one of my best friends because he had commitments with his girlfriend, I managed to have a good time with the others. We went out for dinner, hit up a bar to reminisce about old times, and in general, it was a fun trip, regardless of what happened with my mother. So that's been the summary of what's happened recently. Update 3. My mother has definitely left her boyfriend. Or rather, he left her. And he did it for another woman. How do I know? Well, because she sent me a long email, as usual, blaming me for everything. According to her, it's my fault that her boyfriend left with another woman, and now her life is completely ruined. I guess when she says, my fault, she's referring to the fact that I didn't agree to give her my salary and then wait for her immense generosity to give me a portion of it, if it wasn't too much to ask. Because, of course, according to her logic, if I had given her all my money, she would have been able to keep her man, and then, with her supposed generosity, she would have given me a part of my own money. If I was a good son, of course. In the same email, she also mentioned that she had quit her job. Apparently, her boyfriend convinced her that it wasn't good for her to keep working, and now she says she has nothing. As for me, I decided not to respond to her. I'm tired of trying to be a good son to someone who never bothered to be a mother to me. I no longer feel like I owe her anything. I have my life, my dream job here in Alaska, and while it's not perfect, it's enough for me. Plus, every now and then I get a visit from a moose. I can't be a good host to them. They'd be capable of destroying my house, but I wave at them from a distance, and they move along. Update 4. My mother has ended up without a place to live. She hasn't been able to pay the rent, and, as expected, I received another one of her long emails where she blames me for everything that has happened. The news, or what she considers the good news, in quotes, is that she's back with her boyfriend. Though, if you ask me, I'm not sure it's good news for anyone except her. But I guess from her perspective, this is a victory, since at least now she has a place to stay. I don't know where her boyfriend has found a place to live, because from what little I knew about him, he was living with my mother. In the email, as usual, she starts by attacking me, accusing me of being a bad son for not supporting her. I'm not even surprised anymore, to be honest. In fact, I've started to take this with humor. I make myself a coffee, and every time she mentions I'm a bad son, I take a sip. It's a little game, but by the time I finished her email, I consumed all the caffeine I needed for the day. It's not the most fun game in the world, but at least it keeps me entertained while reading her repeated complaints. The most surreal part of the email is when she mentions that her boyfriend is a real man, because, according to her, he takes care of the people he loves instead of abandoning them. I had to read that twice to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. Is she talking about the same man who left her for another woman? I'm almost sure it's the same guy because she confirms it later in the email. Apparently, her boyfriend left the other woman because, and I quote, he realized he truly loved my mother. And that, according to my mother, is more important than anything else in the world. Even more important than having a son who, according to her, only thinks about himself. But the best part of the email and I'm glad I kept reading before deleting it, is the ending. That's where she drops the real bombshell. They're getting married. Yes, you read that right. My mother and her boyfriend, the one who recently left her, have decided to get married. She even told me that she hoped I would understand if I wasn't invited to the wedding because, in her words, I haven't earned the right to be part of such a special moment. I don't know if I should feel offended or relieved, but one thing's for sure. I won't be sitting around waiting for an invitation. Update 5. I was unsure whether to post another update or not, because the situation with my mother is so predictable that it's starting to feel like an endless loop. Her dynamic with this man is always the same. They fight, they reconcile, they fall in love again, and then, as expected, they fight again. The cycle repeats over and over without any real change. And now, here we are again. I received another one of her emails, which, to be honest, I find quite amusing. Someone asked me before why I receive emails from her instead of calls or messages. The reason is simple. I blocked her on my phone, so now she sends me these updates via email, which has turned into a sort of daily entertainment for me. In this latest email, she informs me that she had to find a new place to stay and also a job. The reason, as you can probably guess, is that her boyfriend left her again. This time, there are no scandalous details about whether it was for another woman or simply because the lunar cycle indicated so. The only thing for sure is that, knowing my mother, they'll probably be back together in a few months, in what will be the next round of this never-ending cycle. To be honest, I don't know if I'll keep updating this story. While it may seem funny from the outside at times, the reality is that not much really changes in what happens. If something truly big happens, maybe I'll write again. But for now, I think this will be my last update.